Okay, it's going to pop up here. We're going to get going. I'll just start talking store business until we
Yeah.
get past 4. Oh, and here we are. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you all. Welcome out to this event with us on this beautiful Saturday afternoon in Salt Lake City. This is Lane Richens coming to you from Weller Bookworks. I'm the events coordinator here. And we are pleased to be welcoming today Mr. Kapil Komireddi,
Kapil Komireddi, yes.
Kapil Komireddi, and Mr. Issam Ahmed. This is Kapil's book, Malevolent Republic, a short history of the new India. And before we get into that, I'm just going to go through a little bit of store business that we've got coming up and talk about some events we have happening here soon. This happens to be Independent Bookstore Month, and we are very grateful to have both of you here sort of celebrating that with us. We have a couple of other events happening here soon. The next event we have celebrating this month is on the 14th here on Wednesday. It's with Frederick Swanson and Stephen Trimble, and this is a book called From Back of Beyond to Instagram. It's about a century of Utah's natural parks, and it's obviously anyone that lives in Utah or the West knows how important these parks are. And Utah and the parks are essentially the same. And we've had both of these gentlemen before, and we're looking forward to that. We have our twice monthly knitting circle called Lit Knit, and that happens the 2nd and 4th Wednesdays of every month. So that falls on this coming Wednesday and on the 28th as well. And then just a moment to talk about Independent Bookstore Day itself. That is on Saturday, the 24th. And we will have, for the first time, some authors to be visited with. We have a large outdoor court in the courtyard here at Trolley Square. And we will have 7 authors here signing, masked up, socially distanced. And those authors are Dan Wells, Charlie Holmberg, Emily King, Catherine Purdy, Trisha Levenseller, Howard Taylor, and Adam Berg. And that will be from 2 to 4 that day. From 1 to 2, we have a couple of our favorite authors coming virtually to you. Courtney Carver, who is an old friend of ours. She will speak to you about simplicity in your life. Most of you who have been in Salt Lake for any amount of time know who Courtney is. And then Justin Call, our buddy who wrote the Artificer series, he will be here as well. Courtney will be here from 1 to 1:20, 1:30. Justin will be here from 1:30 to 2. And then we've got a trivia contest going from 4 to 5, Literary Jeopardy. And then from 5 to 6, adult story time with literary cocktails. I think one of them is Turn of the Screwdriver, maybe we're looking at. So those are happening on the 24th. Okay. So I'm going to give a quick introduction to our guests here. Once again, I want to express my gratitude towards both of you for being here. First of all, let's tell each other, everybody, where we are.
Hi, I'm in London at the moment.
And I'm in Washington, D.C.
All over the world. This is the best part about virtual events. And it's my favorite part. So we're joined here by Issam Ahmed. He is a health, science, and environment reporter for the global news agency known as Agence France Presse. He has posted in Pakistan as a reporter and in Hong Kong as an editor. And between '08 and 2012, he covered Pakistan for the Christian Science Monitor during the height of the country's Taliban insurgencies. Welcome, Issam. It's nice to have you here.
Thank you very much, Lane.
And of course, our man of the hour, here is his book once again, Kapil Komireddi. He was born in India, he was educated there and in England, where he is right now. His commentary, criticism, and journalism have come from South Asia, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East. And they've appeared in places, in publications such as The Economist, New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, The Guardian, The New Statesman, Time Magazine. Maybe you could get them posted in some publications we've heard of. Anyway, we're grateful to have you here, Kapil. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me, Lane.
I'm going to turn the time over to these two gentlemen. They're going to give you a presentation. It'll be about 30-40 minutes. And then afterwards, if you would like to have some questions answered, you can post your questions in the chat on the side of the video here, or you can post on our Facebook page underneath the post for this event. So without further ado, I thank you both once again, and I will turn the time over to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks, Lane, and thanks, Well, a Book Works. So here is the book. I think you can see it. Malevolent Republic, A Short History of the New India, was published to critical acclaim in the UK and India, and it is now available in the United States. It's a fast-moving history of the Indian Republic from independence in 1947 to Narendra Modi's re-election 2 years ago, and the first comprehensive account of India's slide into sectarian authoritarianism. Kapil Komireddi, the author, has written from numerous countries and conflict zones, including Syria. His work appears in all the leading publications of the world, and he has been described by The Spectator as the V.S. Naipaul of his generation. And he's also a personal friend of mine. Thank you for having me do this, Caps. I'm very glad to be doing it.
Thank you, Sam.
We've known each other for over a decade and a half, and I've always known you had a great book in you, and this is a fantastic book. It's a cracking read. It has a lot of original arguments. Let's maybe start at the beginning and tour our way through it a little bit. So the book begins with a recollection of your friendship with a Muslim schoolmate in Hyderabad, which is where you're from. He was later tortured by the authorities and, tried to pin some crimes on him. It introduces us to the origins of Hindu nationalism, India's partition, and its consequences. The old secular India of your parents' generation was already beginning to disappear in the late 1990s. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your friendship and tell us about, that transformation and what happened to Murad and how that dovetailed with what happened, the transformation that India underwent in the 1990s.
Yeah, so thank you, Issam, for doing this. Thank you, Well, a Book Works, for hosting us. And thanks to everyone who's joining us for this event. I was sent by my parents to, as a young boy, I spent some time at an Islamic seminary, a madrasa, where I became very good friends with a young man. And our paths, we went separate ways. And many years later, when we caught up, I discovered that he had endured, he had been exposed to the roughest edges of India's secular state. He had been accused of terrorism and tortured, and he was leaving India. And this was a time I thought that India, the India of my parents' generation, was fading out of existence. India was founded as a secular democracy. And after the partition of the subcontinent, there was a lot of pressure on the founders of the Indian nation to respond to the provocation of partition by making India a formerly Hindu state, and they refused. They said India is going to be a homeland of all its people. But that promise began to sour in the 80s, and by the 90s, you could see the consequences of that souring. And this young man became, for me, a symbol of the failure of the secular promise, of what had gone wrong. And Hindu nationalism itself, of course, originated in the 1920s in response to the failure of the Congress Party to respond adequately to the grievances of the Hindu community. And they then broke away from the Congress Party and founded the RSS, the movement to create a Hindu political community. But they didn't really have an audience beyond upper caste Hindu men until the partition of India. Once a state had been created for India's Muslims, the argument went what remained should logically be identified as the state of India's Hindus. And as I mentioned, India's founders rejected that. So the Hindu nationalists retaliated, and they assassinated Mahatma Gandhi, who refused their entreaties to convert India into a Hindu state, who stood firmly against them and wanted cordial relations between India and Pakistan, and especially between Hindus and Muslims. And these Hindu nationalists then farmed out into the towns and villages of India and fomented a revolution bottom up. And the consequences of that revolution were visible to us in the 90s, when Murad, my friend, was the victim of those consequences. And I begin with that recollection because I thought his life was such a gripping portrait of so much that had gone wrong in India.
I mean, it's quite, I mean, unusual. Just if you could tell us a little bit more about how your paths came to cross in the first place. Your father, I mean, you are at least culturally, or I don't know about religiously, a Hindu, and yet your father put you in a madrasa, Islamic seminary. Why did he do that? What was his thinking behind that?
Well, one of the things many people don't know is that Hyderabad was people think that the partition of India was a phenomenon concentrated in the north of India and the east of India, in Bengal and Punjab and Kashmir. But Hyderabad, my city, was also singed by the furies of partition. And my own family was caught up in the maelstrom. And I think my parents resolved that they should inoculate me and their children and my siblings from they should inoculate me against the temptations of sectarianism in later life by giving us as much exposure as possible to Muslim Indians. And we lived in a predominantly Muslim area, and culturally, I would say I have very strong influences of that upbringing. And that was the reason I think they sent me there. And I fictionalized aspects of it to hide the identity on the advice of people. But that was a very formative experience for me, and I only understood its significance much later when Modi came to power.
Mm. And you, in fact, lost touch with Murad for many years, right? And you only picked up his story. You came into contact with him.
Yes, much later. I lost contact with him, and he revived my memories of our friendship many years later. And by then, India was a different country, and I obviously living as an expatriate abroad. I had a somewhat roseate view of India, and he found himself, exposed to the darker side of that India, and okay. India was unsparing to him.
Now, the book, I understand, was written originally with your editor as a book about Narendra Modi, who is the current prime minister. But you decided, before you talk about Modi, you want to take us on a journey of how we came to Modi. So the book is in two parts. The second part is India under Modi. The first is called Antecedents, and it compresses 60 years of Indian history into its pages, into its first pages. Now, we know that you are a searing critic of Modi, and yet I think one of the striking things about the book, something which the critics have noted, is that you are no fanboy of the Secular Congress Party that he defeated and that remains in opposition. You know, the Gandhi Nehru dynasty is a very positive image in the West, and you really lay into that. Could you please? I know it's a lot, but could you tell us why?
Yeah. So so once India becomes independent, India is led by Nehru, whose father was the president of the Congress Party. So dynasticism was very much injected into the genetic makeup of the Congress Party before India became independent. And the Congress Party is really the engine of India's freedom movement. Congress Party is not so much a political party as a movement. And once India becomes independent, there is what is the Congress Party? And Mahatma Gandhi says Congress must be disbanded in order to foster a multi-party democracy, but he's ignored, and Nehru becomes the prime minister. And Nehru is a Democrat to his marrow. He is an incredibly powerful man. After the death of Gandhi and his deputy Sardar Patel, there's really nobody in India. He's unchallenged within the Congress Party, and yet his power is tempered with this great awareness of the responsibility before him. He sees himself as a preceptor, as a teacher, and he defers to his colleagues. He attends parliament every day, and he's submissive to the judiciary. He doesn't interfere in autonomous institutions. He's a Democrat to his core. But once Nehru nonetheless has an authoritarian streak in him. He legislates the AFSPA, Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which authorizes the Indian state to commit unspeakable atrocities against people who want to resist the Indian Union, who do not see themselves as Indian, who want to secede from the Indian Union, who want effectively the kind of sovereignty India attained from Britain. But that authoritarian streak exists alongside this Democrat. In the following generation, his daughter, when she comes to power in 1966, she really is she's the true authoritarian. She's asked by an American journalist, she tells an American journalist, she has a very interesting conversation. She says, do you think any of these people could hold this thing together? And he says, by this thing, you mean the Congress Party, right? She says, no, I mean India. In 1968, she breaks the party and she rules as a dynast. She rules, the Congress effectively becomes a family fief. And internal democracy begins gradually to vanish from the Congress Party. And today we are told, the Congress Party tells its critics that, this is the way of India. All political parties are run by dynasties. But that is not true. If that is the argument you're going to advance, you could use that argument to say that India was never democratic. India has only been democratic for 70 years. India was a feudal society. We should have left it at that. India ceased to be a feudal society and became a progressively democratic society because the Congress Party said that we could do better. So the same Congress Party is now saying that, this is the way things are. And it in fact has bred this culture of dynasticism. And Modi, in so many ways, a self-made man raised by lower caste parents who sold tea and cleaned homes, he's the antithesis of that. Sorry. Go on. No,
just as India 101 for people who don't know, Indira Gandhi, and the Gandhi dynasty, no relation to Mahatma Gandhi. If you could just explain that really quickly.
She is not related to Mahatma Gandhi. Indira Gandhi married a gentleman called Feroz Gandhi. Feroz Gandhi was a Zoroastrian, and he happened to have that last name, which he embraced, and that seems to have served. Many in the Parsi community have names such as Daruwala or engineer. Daruwala means, liquor merchant. If Feroz Gandhi had had such a surname, as Shashi Tharoor once pointed out, the trajectory of India's history would have been very, very different indeed.
So it was a convenient surname to have.
A very convenient surname, which is why I think it was adopted.
Okay. And just going back to how we get to more you talk about one of the darkest periods in India's history is the emergency period from 1975 to 77. You liken it to dictatorship. Can you talk about that? What happened then?
Yeah, it was a dictatorship in all but name. What happened is in 1975, a lower court disqualified the prime minister from holding office, from holding her seat in parliament because of some procedural violation. And she would have had to step down from office effectively. So in retaliation, to prevent that from happening, what she did is she invoked the articles of emergency in the constitution and said there's a state of internal emergency, and she suspended the constitution and ruled effectively as a dictator for 21 months. And during that period, the Congress Party was gangsterized beyond recognition. Its upper echelons were taken over by men with loyalty to the dynasty, and frankly, they were thuggish men. And her son, her oldest son, Sanjay Gandhi, became what was known as the extra constitutional authority. He was a dropout, and he was very much India's Ceausescu in the sense that he had these ideas to beautify India. So he ordered the demolition of slums, predominantly Muslim slums. He wanted to build casinos in the Himalayas. He was impatient. And what he did is he arrived upon this idea that India's great misfortune was its population. So to curb India's population growth, he started this reign of terror called sterilization. Millions of men were forcibly sterilized. There were roving sterilization squads. Families started living, men in families, rural families started living in the farms to evade capture by these roving sterilization squads. They would descend upon bus stops, train stations, pick up men and surgically mutilate them. By the end of it, 6.2 million Indians were mutilated surgically. That is 15 times the number of men sterilized by the Nazis, to give you an idea of what happened. And during this time, India's intellectual gentry were finding excuses, advancing mitigations for Indira Gandhi, and they were saying that India was never really suited to be a democracy. India always needed enlightened despotism of the kind supplied by the Gandhi dynasty. And in 1977, Mrs. Gandhi, unable to bear criticism, accumulating criticism abroad, because she cared very much about what people in the West thought about her because of the family she belonged to, she called elections. And she called elections not because she was a Democrat at her marrow, and not because she was Nehru's daughter, but because her intelligence people told her that she was going to sweep the elections. So she called an election. And it is the very people who were thought to be unsuited to democracy, the poor people of India, who showed up in large numbers and ousted her and her son. They lost their own seats, and Congress was thrown out of power for the first time in India's history. That's an extraordinary affirmation of, I think, India's democratic spirit.
And yet that coalition, I understand, was sort of cobbled together by sort of very disparate.
Very disparate, yes. There were socialists, there were capitalists, there were communists, there were Hindu nationalists. It was an ideologically kaleidoscopic coalition that collapsed because it didn't know how to wield power. People like that didn't wield power in India. And Indira Gandhi had set a horrendous template with her abuses.
And so Congress comes back, and yet one of the most consequential figures that you talk about in the book, which is sort of omitted in sort of, the outside world has forgotten the name, is P.V. Narasimha Rao. And you argue he is the most consequential leader of India since Nehru. Why? What makes that the case?
Well, Narasimha Rao is now forgotten in India and neglected in the West, but he becomes the prime minister. He's really a regional politician. He's a very erudite figure. He speaks a dozen languages. He was Indira Gandhi's foreign minister. And I'll give you one anecdote. In 1980, he was in Cuba, and he was Indira Gandhi's foreign minister, and he got a message asking him to try and persuade members of the non-aligned movement to move their upcoming summit from Baghdad in Iraq, which was then at war with Iran, to Delhi. And he then proceeded to disarm everybody by speaking in Spanish to the Cubans, in Persian with the Iranians, Urdu with the Pakistanis, who understood English perfectly well, French to a host of African nations. And by the end, he'd succeeded in his mission. He was a very brilliant, erudite figure, but he kept his thoughts to himself. He was a disastrous Home Minister of India because during his time as Home Minister, there was a pogrom against the Sikhs, pogrom of the Sikhs under Rajiv Gandhi's premiership. But by 1991, when Rajiv Gandhi himself, who was Indira Gandhi's son and succeeded her, he was assassinated by Sri Lankan Tamil tiger. There was really nobody to replace Rajiv Gandhi within the party, within the Congress party. Sonia Gandhi was a recently naturalized Roman Catholic of Italian origin. Her son, her children, Rahul Gandhi, who's now the de facto leader of the Congress party, and Priyanka Gandhi, who now wields considerable influence in the party, were too young to occupy a position. So by a process of elimination, P.V. Narasimha Rao was picked as a successor to Rajiv Gandhi, even though he despised Rajiv Gandhi and wrote an article anonymously saying this man was, a pampered milksop. And people thought he was innocuous and not dangerous. But as soon as he became prime minister, I'll give you an idea of what India was like in 1991. The population was 800 million. There were 5 million telephone lines. Coca-Cola was as contraband in India as alcohol is in Saudi Arabia. To manufacture a vacuum cleaner, you had to get a license. To import a computer, you had to make 50 trips to Delhi. India was governed by a state religion that called itself socialism. As someone put it, all it did was distribute poverty. And $2 billion separated India from bankruptcy. So when Rao came to office, he conscripted Manmohan Singh from the University Grants Commission as his finance minister, and he started deregulating the industry and pulling down barriers to investment. And by the time he left office, India was founded upon 4 pillars, Issam: democracy, socialism, secularism, and non-alignment in foreign affairs. Non-alignment in foreign affairs became pretty much meaningless after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So Rao tilted India closer to the United States. Secularism effectively went into a coma when Hindu nationalists pulled down the Babri Mosque. He did nothing to stop that from happening. Democracy was subverted because all these decisions to liberalize India's economy were made, most of them, most consequential ones, were made as executive decisions, and prices were hiked when Parliament went into recess. And socialism, India ceased to be a socialist country. Even communists became, admirers of foreign investors. And today's India, for better and for worse, is his India. But the reason he has been written out of India's story is because he led the Congress party and not the Gandhi dynasty. And when the Gandhi dynasty reasserted their control of the party in 1998, they scrubbed him out of its story. And credit for his achievements was given to Manmohan Singh and to Rajiv Gandhi absurdly. And he was nominated alongside Chairman Deng as the Man of the Year by the Financial Times. He was the Wall Street Journal, your former newspaper, Christian Science Monitor, effusively praised him. And he was seen as the greatest, he's the father of India's economic liberalization. I don't agree with everything he did. But he left behind an India that was richer, but vastly more unequal. He remains the only Prime Minister of India to be denied a memorial in Delhi. And when he died, the bier bearing his body was not allowed to alight at the Congress Party headquarters. His wake was not allowed to take place in Delhi. His funeral had to take place in Hyderabad. He was unpersoned posthumously. And that bespeaks the power and the vindictiveness of the Gandhi dynasty.
And yet, as you say, P.V. Narasimha Rao was the man who paved the groundwork for India as we know it today. The economically liberalized, much more wealthy, and yet divided economically. Now, there's an interesting argument that you put forward in your book, which I found very original, and something which I had not really come across myself. Now, you accuse India's secular historians obfuscating Indian history. As I understand the nugget of the argument, you say that the Hindu nationalists had, that there was some real trauma among Hindu Indians from the succession of Islamic invasions across the course of 1,000 years. You say to negate that is to whitewash history, just as you don't negate the horrors of European colonialism. You liken the conquests from Western Central Asia to European colonialism in some ways, and you say that it was the inadequacy of India to really grapple with that had sort of gave the opening for Hindu nationalism to say that we are aggrieved and nobody's addressing our grievances.
Yeah, I made that up. Listen, Hindu nationalism, one of the great powers, one of the great animating powers of Hindu nationalism is this emotional identification by seeing themselves as victims of history. Look, India was repeatedly raided and plundered by Islamic invaders who came from the West, and a great deal of India's liturgical heritage was ravaged during these invasions. And that fact was consciously hidden from Indians and obfuscated and downplayed by India's early nation builders, because they believed that in the aftermath of India's partition, to talk about that would, their motives were very lofty. They didn't want to grant ammunition to Hindus against Muslims. Muslims are a very vulnerable population at that point. But also the baleful consequence of that decision is that it denied Indians. There was a festering wound, and that could have been healed by supplying Indians with a forthright accounting of their history. By denying that, what they did is they allowed Hindu nationalists to weaponize history. I experienced this myself. I didn't know any of this history, or I knew only the outlines of it in India. And it was in England as a graduate student, I came upon first-hand sources and read, Vasav's account of the reduction of Cambay, and it's a very gory account. And I had very strong secular upbringing, so I had enough fortification in me not to feel any vindictive temptations. But a lot of Hindus, in the 1980s, there was a movement to demolish the Babri Mosque, which had been built on a site Hindus claim was the birthplace of one of their most revered deities, and there was an existing temple there. Why did that movement have such an appeal? It had such an appeal because it touched upon something. It made Hindus feel that they were undoing the humiliations of history, and they were reclaiming victory. They were reclaiming their pride. And if you pick up a standard history textbook for Indian school teachers, for Indian school children, it will describe the Ghaznavid ruler Mahmud as destructive in India, but it will then advance the mitigation that in his own country, he was responsible for building a beautiful mosque and a large library. That doesn't quite explain what he did in India. And then it says that the Portuguese who arrived in Goa, it says, were intolerant of the existing religions of India and did not hesitate to force people to become Christian. Indeed, they did all they could to make more converts. On the other hand, Islamic invaders, and this is a sentence that really takes the breath away because of its contrast with a candid assessment of the Portuguese arrival, Islamic invaders did not produce any fundamental change in Indian society, but they did help to enrich Indian culture. I mean, that is an extraordinary sentence, and what they were saying is that imperialism is imperialism only when Europeans do it. When Asians do it, it's a cultural exchange program, and we should all be, it's a wonderful thing. And that kind of thing was acceptable when post-colonial secular elites were strong and powerful. But once India began to democratize and the secularists were discredited because of the deeds of the Congress Party, you couldn't sell that argument. And what you now see in its stead is a crude understanding of history, where every Muslim is painted as a villain, where where the very cultural synthesis of India, the socio-religious synthesis that occurred between Hinduism and Islam, which is, which produced so many beautiful things in architecture, in food, is completely denied. That is seen as a stain upon India, and there is this quest to cleanse Hindus of the taint of Islam. And that, I think, is a result of our refusal to accept what happened.
Right. So your argument is that a more realistic reckoning with some of the bloodiness of history can, in fact, take the sting out of communal tensions by sort of acknowledging that these things occurred, and it is no stain upon the.
It's just grown up. It's just a grown-up way of dealing with history, and now we can no longer do that because that moment has passed. And I write in the book that the only way to escape the torments of history, the only way we can emancipate ourselves from the torments of history, is being honest about history. But now that moment has passed, and now you see people, names of roads being changed from Mughal rulers to Hindu rulers or Hindu leaders. There's a kind of vindictiveness, and we could have arrived at all of that. I mean, you don't have to kill each other for events that happened 5 years ago. But if events that happened 5 years ago are creating such chaos and turmoil in your country, you ought to ask yourself, why do the events of events that occurred 500 years ago hold such appeal to people? You have to ask yourself that question.
Yes. Yeah. I think you're referencing the fact that, after 2002 and the Gujarat riots, people were sort of asked to forget about that. That's the old history when Modi was trying. I think we're getting ahead of it. We'll come back to that.
Sure.
So just in the last of the sort of the antecedents section, let's talk about Manmohan Singh, the respected economist who was India's prime minister from 2004 to 2014. As you already noted, in 1991, he was appointed the finance minister and helped set India on its present path. His reputation has been recently burnished by none other than Barack Obama, who in his book referred to him as a statesman and a guide. You, on the other hand, call him India's Pinochet, and let's get to that. Can you explain that?
Yeah, sure. In 1991, when Dr. Singh became India's finance minister and unveiled his first budget liberalizing the economy, he made a promise. He said, "I promise that in dealing with the people of India, I shall be soft-hearted." In 2009, as the Prime Minister of India, his government started something called Operation Green Hunt, which was to unleash paramilitary forces, armed forces, against the most destitute people, not just in India, but the world, who happen to be sitting atop mineral wealth, minerals that India's, robber barons need to feed their industries. And the government, lost faith in consultation and dialogue and decided that the way to do this was to really scare them into just submitting. And his government contemplated using India's Air Force against people who picked up arms against the state in these places. This is something the British Empire, at the height of its violent rage, would not consider doing, using the Air Force against its own subjects, in India, its own citizens. During Prime Minister Singh's reign, 16,000 farmers killed themselves every single year for all but 2 years that he was in office, but 10 years. And many of them wrote suicide notes directly to him. Why is this? Because by 2007, consider this, India was $1 trillion economy. By 2009, it added 42,000 new members to the ranks of its dollar millionaires. And by 2010, it was home to 8 of the world's richest people. But that prosperity wasn't trickling down. People had been moved from, statistically, India, lifted a lot of people out of poverty, as you keep reading. But in realistic terms, they were moved out of, poverty into a barely tolerable form of destitution. More than 400 million Indians lived below the poverty line in 2010. 46% of all children were malnourished in 2011. That's 2 years before Prime Minister Singh left office, 3 years before Prime Minister Singh left office. And the Supreme Court of India, not me, upbraided him severely for pushing the poor to the wall and unleashing violence in the countryside with, I quote, predatory forms of capitalism supported by the state. It was difficult in India. I traveled through the country. I did pro bono work for a lot of people who were exposed to the rough edges of Prime Minister Singh's enlightened rule. And you know, in India at that time, if you said anything critical of Prime Minister Singh or his belief, he was himself an ideologue. He himself is an ideologue. If you said anything critical of him, you were accused of being anti-development, just as you're now accused of being anti-national by the Modi government. I'm not an extreme leftist who believes that, you know, private capital is a crime or a sin, but realistically, the kind of praise that was being showered upon India, it was being called the next superpower. It was difficult to reconcile that with what I witnessed in the countryside in India, meeting ordinary people who lost everything. And the New Yorker described Manmohan Singh as, you know, one of the greatest statesmen in India. I just couldn't see any. The man you saw in the West was not the man, you know, ordinary Indians. His policies affected ordinary Indians in a very different way. And I think as intellectuals, Indian intellectuals at the time were drunk on this idea that India was the next superpower. And I think they really, now they're awakening. Now they, you know, a lot of them will say that, you know, Modi is the greatest evil there ever was. But the very same people at that time were just completely blind to what was happening around them, were completely blind to the horror show outside of the big cities in India. They really betrayed their duties. They abdicated their duties and they betrayed the people at that time.
It was not just this yawning and widening gulf in who got the economic spoils, but it was also this brutalization of
Absolutely.
people who,
that's very well phrased. Yeah, it was not just the accumulation of wealth at the very top. It was the subjecting these people to extraordinary brutality to take what was theirs. And the template was really instituted by that government.
Okay, but just I think a very minor thing to pick you up on. I think you mentioned that the British didn't consider bombing the Indians. I think they did in Waziristan.
I was specifically referring to a minute by one of the British officers who, during the Quit India movement, wrote a long piece. I was referring to that, sorry, which I cite, I think, in the book.
I see. Okay, now time for Modi. Now, when Modi sort of first sprang into the consciousness of the world, really, it was because he presided over a massacre of Muslims in 2002 in his home state of Gujarat. Sort of fiddling while Rome was burning, so to speak. He was barred by the Bush administration from entering the US. He was reviled in other Western countries. How did he go from there to become India's prime minister just a decade later? And can you sort of paint us a picture about his life and his politics and what made him?
So Modi was a member of the RSS, which is the Hindu volunteer organization, as I mentioned earlier on, and he internalized all of their messages, or all of their ideology.
I'm not sure you did mention that in Cabs. Could you just like sort of dwell on that a little bit? The RSS.
Yeah, sure. The RSS was founded in 1925 by a physician whose family had fled persecution at the hands of the Muslim ruler of Hyderabad and settled in what is today Maharashtra, the state whose capital is Mumbai. He founded this organization because in 1921 when the caliphate in Turkey collapsed, there was a massacre of Hindus in southern India, in Malabar. And the Congress Party didn't adequately condemn that massacre because it wanted to create a united front against the British. And a lot of these Hindus who, newly politically conscious Hindus, broke away from the Congress Party. Congress was, really a collection of pressure groups. And one of these pressure groups broke away and founded the RSS to create a culturally conscious Hindu community, and really mimicking what they saw as the strengths of Islam, community, fidelity to each other. And during this time, V.D. Savarkar, the founding father, if you will, of Hindu nationalism, published his own book about what was, Hindu nationalism. And in that, he identified Hindus as a people, as the inhabitants of India. Anybody could be an Indian so long as he or she subscribed to Hinduism. But Muslims were explicitly excluded from that definition because they practiced a faith that originated, he wrote, in Arabia. Therefore, their loyalty was to Arab lands. They could never see India as their sacred homeland, as Hindus could, because their religion grew out of India. And they really were driven out of, out of power. They had no seat at the table because one of theirs a Hindu nationalist assassinated Mahatma Gandhi for allowing the partition of India to take place. So Modi internalized that idea that India was a great victim of history. In fact, Ashish Nandi, who's a clinical psychologist, he met Modi and he interviewed Modi, and he came away shaken. And I'll read you what he said when Modi was really a nobody, just a propagandist for the RSS. Modi, Nandi wrote, met virtually all the criteria that psychiatrists, psychoanalysts, and psychologists had set up after years of empirical work on the authoritarian personality. He had the same mix of puritanical rigidity, narrowing of emotional life, massive use of the ego, defense of projection, denial and fear of his own passions, combined with fantasies of violence, all set within the matrix of clear paranoid and obsessive personality traits. I still remember the cool, measured tone in which he elaborated the theory of cosmic conspiracy against India that painted every Muslim as a suspected traitor and a potential terrorist. I emerged from the interview shaken. He wrote he had met a textbook case of a fascist and a prospective killer, perhaps even a future mass murderer. In 2001, Modi became the chief minister of Gujarat, which was the bastion of Hindu nationalism, prosperous middle class.
This was a man who had left his family life, he'd left his mother to become sort of.
As a young man, he left his mother. He was married at a very young age. He didn't really have a say in the matter. There's a tradition of child marriage in many parts of India that survived legislative reform. He left his wife, his mother, and wandered off into the Himalayas, spent some time there, and became a propagandist for the RSS, traveled throughout the country, and acquired a reputation as a very disciplined and a very capable organizer, even though there are accounts of people who say he was lazy, but he was. You cannot make a name for yourself if you're lazy. When you become famous, people will obviously say that you're not that great. Some people will create legends for you. But Modi survived all of that and became, in Gujarat, a fairly important player. And he had to be moved out of Gujarat. He was seconded to the BJP, which is really the political arm of the RSS. He was moved out of Gujarat because he was an intriguer. He was constantly creating trouble for the party in the state. And he was brought to Delhi. And in 2000, I believe, there was an earthquake in Gujarat. And the chief minister, the chief executive of the state, the equivalent of the governor in an American state, was quite incompetent, actually. So Modi borrowed a jet from a businessman in Delhi and arrived in the scene before the chief minister. And the media focused its attention upon him. And he writes that in 2001, the prime minister of India, who was a Hindu nationalist, but a moderate Hindu nationalist, running a coalition government, invited Modi and said, you must go and become the chief minister of Gujarat. And that's where Modi's political career begins, as in office. And he arrives in Gujarat, and within months of his arrival, a train carrying 58 Hindu pilgrims from the site of the Babri Mosque is torched, and these 58 people die. Their charred bodies are recovered. Before the cause of the arson could be established, Modi ascribes it to Islamic terrorists. And he cites Newton's third law. He says, every action will have an equal and opposite reaction. Within days, Gujarat goes up in flames. Hundreds and hundreds of people are slaughtered. Muslim women's, there are stories of, wombs being torn open and fetuses being pulled out. It's beyond description, the horror. People are burnt alive. And Modi, there is an international clamor for Modi sacking, and India, which is just being seen as this great democracy, because this is right after 9/11. The Bush administration is trying aggressively to court India, and Bush administration bans him from coming to the United States, and there is increasing pressure on the prime minister to sack him. He tries to sack him, but the RSS intervenes and says, no, he's there to stay. And what does Modi do? Modi is a pariah at this stage. Nobody wants to touch him. India, which is still a fairly liberal country at this stage, by liberal I mean, committed to the idea of secularity. In the mainstream public life, Modi is a pariah. So what he does is he hires an American public relations firm, APCO, and he starts inviting big businesses. He starts inviting businessmen from abroad. In India, starting a business is obviously, as you know, very difficult. You start the company and your grandson starts producing something. That's the kind of red tapeism and bureaucracy that Indians have become accustomed to. But what Modi does is he offers clearances right then and there. Within 3 days of your application, you have your land ready. And what do industrialists want? They want expediency. They want fast results. And they're quite drawn to Modi. And Modi says, I've given up all of this. I'm focusing on economics. And by 2009, there are Sorry?
Given up all of this, you mean his nationalistic ideal, Hindu nationalism?
He subordinates that to his, he casts himself as the reformer, right? And by 2009, big businessmen, industrialists, India's most respected industrialists, are turning up in Gujarat and tripping over themselves to praise him. It's quite squalid, really, when you read that. It's really tawdry. This kind of stuff they say. They say he's the uncrowned king of India, just because he's getting them permits. And people forget Gujarat. And there's this myth that Gujarat is the most, Gujarat is the only first world state in India. And Modi is aggressive at his PR, and he pushes his people push a lot of what you now call fake news or disinformation, trying to create this portrait of Gujarat as the Singapore of India. That's really not true. There are many other places in India where you could have a better quality of life, but that idea takes root. And by 2014, Modi is seen as, his faith makes him unassailable. He survives the contumely and contempt of Anglophone Indians. And by 2014, Prime Minister Singh is presiding over an extraordinarily corrupt, or at least perceivably corrupt, administration. And Modi is seen as the savior of India. As I cite in the book, his slogan was "Good days will come." He projects himself not as a Hindu nationalist, but as an inclusive, modernizing technocrat who will carry all Indians with him. That's the kind, and a fleet of intellectuals, public intellectuals, on cue, come together to say that this is exactly the leader India needs. Oh, forget about what happened in Gujarat. That was such a long time ago. Some of these people who want vengeance for what the Mughals did 500 years ago, or what some Muslim invader did, what Imaduddin Qasim did in the 8th century. They want people to forget what happened under Modi in 2002, and there is nobody really to take him on at this stage. The Congress party is a busted flush, and by 2014, the citadels of Congress power look like Tehran after Shah Reza Pahlavi has left, and Ayatollah Khomeini is about to glide into Tehran. And Modi is really unstoppable. He just, he's the hand grenade, as I write in my book, hurled by all those who've been sneered at by India's Anglophone elites. He's the leader of the left behinds, but he's also, like Donald Trump, but he's also claiming to be, an inclusive technocrat, modernizing, inclusive democratic leader who his own supporters know is also the most committed Hindu nationalist, because he never apologizes for Gujarat and he never disavows his Hindu nationalism.
So Congress basically loses their grip in the late 90s. You have, for the first time, a BJ government elected. Then they pass the torch back to Congress.
Congress runs the country from 2004 to 2014. at the top of a coalition. But obviously, by 2014, Manmohan Singh holds exactly 3 press conferences. He's never won an election in his life, ever, to nothing. He's just been appointed. He has no contact with Indians. He has no avenue for contact with Indians. And this is an odd scenario where the politics are being handled by Sonia Gandhi, the head of the Congress party. And the power is, administration is being run by Manmohan Singh. Nobody respects him within the government. There's a reputation for phenomenal corruption within the cabinet, even though Manmohan Singh himself has a cast iron reputation for being personally incorruptible.
But that's the thing. Manmohan Singh was supposed to be the economic reformer, and here comes this guy saying, "Well, I'm the economic reformer." And
because the reforms stalled. Because in the years before Manmohan's at the end of his term, there are massive protests against corruption, and there's a gridlock. And you get the feeling, if you're in Delhi in 2003, 2013, 2014. That of this great status that India has ground to a halt, and Modi really exploited that very well. And he also, obviously, the media really deodorized his reputation and magnified and amplified him as the savior India needed. Actually, I met Muslim voters in 2014 who saw him as a disciplined savior because they couldn't abide the Congress party after all those years.
So now the later chapters of the book: cult, chaos, terror, vanity, seizure, disunion. You talk about first of all, let's talk a little bit about the cult aspect of that. How does he sort of propagate this cult around him, and what is it that makes him the strongman persona that he cultivates? He's able to rehabilitate his image. He's able to rehabilitate the image of Hindu nationalism, which didn't have any heroes in the sort of Indian liberation movement. In fact, it had people on the other side of the movement, and it had people who had links to the Nazi party of Germany. He's able to completely turn that around. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, he has constructed a formidable. In fact, the cult of the prime minister is unrivaled in the democratic world. Just last month alone, he had the world's largest sporting stadium named after himself. He's the only living leader to do that. I think the only other stadium bigger than that is in North Korea, and that's named after the Kim dynasty, if I'm not mistaken. And he also had a picture of himself catapulted into the space by India Space Agency. And I wrote about this recently in the Washington Post about his cult. And one of the ironies of this, of course, Issam, is that the BJP is a traditionally democratic party, his party. His own rise bespeaks the democratic nature of the BJP, because he's the son, as I mentioned, of lower caste, impoverished Hindu parents his mother cleaned dishes and his father sold tea. And this man's rise to the pinnacle of Indian power happened because of the BJP. And one of the things he does is he congressizes the BJP. In other words, he converts the BJP into something akin to the Congress party, where paying tributes to him is the condition of progress in the party. And the man who's now the vice president of India moved a resolution early into Modi's premiership describing him as India's God, God's gift to India and the Messiah of the poor. And one of his junior ministers, and I'm quoting, he wrote on Facebook, French prophet Nostradamus wrote that from 2014 to 2026, a man will lead India whom initially people will hate, but after that people will love him so much that he will be engaged in changing the country's plight and direction. That sort of really garish drivel. And Modi now, there is effectively no cabinet. Nobody expresses opinions. It's the prime minister. Whatever he says is the rule. Parliament effectively functions as a rubber stamping forum, as a billboard where he affixes his plans, not so much as a deliberative chamber of government.
And a lot of this activity happens online, where you sort of have, in the digital arena with WhatsApp and misinformation.
WhatsApp is the single largest tool for spreading disinformation in India, and you see memes spreading around. There's one that made its way into my own phone that said, that had a picture of Modi at his desk, and at the below that it said, Narendra Modi has been declared the greatest prime minister by UNESCO. proud to be an Indian, please share this. And this sort of thing spreads. And that has helped cement this image of him. And he's displaced Nehru, he's displaced Gandhi. He effectively, there's a non-governmental organization that runs handspun cloth, and he effectively replaced Gandhi's image with his own on that. That requires real boldness, and he had that, and he did it. So his cult is basically unrivaled. There was another aspect to your question. Sorry.
Oh no, I mean, if we move on to the chaos and the terror aspect of it, can you talk about this sort of reign of terror that he's unleashed on minorities in India since coming to power, particularly Muslims, who are the largest minority group?
Right. So the terror aspect of this, right. In 2015, just over a year after he became prime minister, a 50-year-old dairy farmer called Muhammad Akhlaq, who had lived with his family in that village for 60 years, was dragged out of his head and beaten to death with bricks. And the accusation against him was that he had eaten beef, or that was storing beef. And the remarkable thing about that is how many people turned up, not to prosecute his killers, but to prosecute his surviving family for eating beef. One of the leaders who did that was, a tonsured priest, a feral priest, enrobed in saffron, whose only possessions were a gun and a car, and he'd made extraordinarily incendiary remarks about Muslims. A year later, Modi made him the chief minister of India's largest, most populous state, Uttar Pradesh. And there are now anti-Romeo squads that go and hunt down Muslims who date Hindu women. There is vigilante violence where any Muslim perceived to be trading in beef, cows are sacred to Hindus, are slaughtered. There's the bogey of love jihad. Muslim men have been dragged out and beaten, and women have been stopped from dating Muslim men. But I'm giving you an overview. In all of this, there are human stories, hundreds of stories. Akhlaq is the one that has stayed with me. And then there was another young boy who was traveling home after Eid, shopping for Eid, and he was just stabbed on a train because he wouldn't stand up when Hindus wanted a seat. And the prime minister originally licensed this with his silence. He would not condemn it. But subsequently, ministers in his government one minister in his government, who I think used to work for an American company in Boston, I don't know if it was McKinsey. I don't want to say it is, but people can look it up. He went with garlands and, garlanded about 24 people who'd been convicted of slaughtering a Muslim man. That's a member of the union government, a member of the cabinet going and doing that. And the prime minister has never said a word. The prime minister has never once memorialized by name a Muslim who has been slaughtered by Hindu fanatics. And there are murder reels of Muslim men being slaughtered that circulate on people's phones. And what you now have really is a self-pitying majority that will see itself as the victim, even though members of its community commit these atrocities.
And I think that's parallel that one can see in many states where majoritarianism takes a hold. Now, it's not just the sort of this sort of violence against minorities. You also detail the seizure of autonomous institutions, this unraveling of very sort of fabric of the republic by the ruling party. Could you give us some of the examples of that?
Yes. The constitutional structure of India was built upon these independent institutions, and Modi has subverted all of them, many of them. In his first term, he went after the Reserve Bank of India. He went after the armed forces. He politicized the armed forces. I remember that India was going to have its first Muslim army chief, and there was an intervention, and somebody junior to him was promoted. The independent press effectively the independent press. India had one of the most vibrant free presses in the world, and today there is so little criticism of the prime minister. There's so little, and the small print publications and online publications that do go after the prime minister must face the wrath of the taxman, or must face the wrath of, some form of bureaucratic hurdle, especially designed to stop them from doing their work. He has the Electoral Commission, which had this cast iron reputation for impartiality, has behaved in ways that are absolutely puzzling. That has behaved in ways that are beneficial only to one party, and you know which party that is, the ruling party. Every single institution, it is difficult to think of an institution in India, be it educational, be it financial, that hasn't succumbed to the prime minister. And that kind of seizure, the problem with that kind of seizure of institutions is that whenever Modi goes, once these institutions began crumbling and collapsing, India itself, stands the risk of collapsing. And whichever government follows Modi, whoever comes after him, will not remedy this. They will, use the powers he's created for himself. Will use the template, just as Indira Gandhi's successors used the methods she perfected. Others will use what Modi has perfected here.
So he's strengthening his grip on power, and you see this backsliding of institutions. And yet, I mean, you as a journalist, you would like to call attention to these, to what is happening, especially the sort of winnowing of these freedoms and this hard-won kind of independence of these institutions. And yet he was returned again to power. I mean, why is that? I mean, he still has this sort of, particular, people still have an affinity for him.
I'll tell you, I believe, I don't have the exact numbers, but the coalition of which he's a part, even though his party has absolute majority in parliament, got about 32% of the vote. That means 68% of Indians did not vote for him. India's tragedy is not Modi. India's tragedy is the absence of an opposition capable of upending Modi. And he has managed to consolidate the Hindu vote. Remember that the Hindu community was massively stratified along lines of caste. His great achievement has been to erode that that stratification, and that is in so many ways a good thing. I don't join with the people who say that, who suddenly find utility for caste. I think if people want, then there was an old saying about India that people don't cast their vote, they vote their caste. Now they vote their religion. That is tragic because they identify primarily with their religion, but a majority of Indians still don't. And if there is a party that can mobilize them against Modi, then India's tragedy is that there isn't an opposition capable of taking on Modi.
I see.
Modi thrives in great part because he doesn't have resistance.
Yeah. You're a searing critic. You called him the worst human being ever elected prime minister. Yet he started following you on Twitter after your book came out. How did that feel?
It felt scary at the time, but I woke up on New Year's Day and I got a message that the prime minister was following me. I was one of the 2,000 people he follows. So I haven't messaged him directly, but a lot of the people the prime minister follows generally issue threats against. But he's following me. That's great.
Do you see anything positive in anything he's done? You just referenced this sort of. Do you? I mean, he is not from a high caste. Do you see a breakdown in caste barriers, for instance?
No, there's not. There's actually, if anything, an intensification of caste prejudice since he's become prime minister. And the positives I see are, there's an old story of the Plotkin diamond about the positives. There's an old Jewish story about the Plotkin diamond. Two women meet up. One of the women is wearing an amazingly beautiful ring, and the woman says, "Oh, what is this ring? Tell me about it." And she says, "This ring used to be worn by, counts and princesses and kings and queens. but it is cursed. And the woman says, a curse, how mysterious. Tell me, what is the curse of this ring? The curse of the Plotkin diamond is it comes with Mr. Plotkin. If you get the diamond, Mr. Plotkin comes in the deal. And the thing with the good things Modi has done is that Modi has done them. For me, that is the problem, because the prime minister primarily is a Hindu nationalist. And that is, whatever good he does, it's good. But I wish a non-Hindu nationalist had done them, because if it results in the advancement of Hindu nationalism, if it results in the sanitization and the entrenchment and the legitimization and the sanctification of Hindu nationalism, then that's not a good thing from where I stand.
But you don't see any watering down of that. I mean, that was the great hope, that it would be watered down, but there's no evidence of that.
No, the idea was that he would, subordinate Hindu nationalism to the economic modernization of India. Instead, everything has become subordinated to Hindu nationalism. In the contest between economic modernization and Hindu nationalism will always trump economic modernization. He's presided over the worst joblessness crisis in India in 45 years. He detonated India's economy with demonetization when he abruptly abolished 86% of all the currency in circulation in India. So these are the actions of, these are very deranged actions taken by a leader who does not have any opposition and does not feel that he's accountable.
In terms of where we go from here, you warn of the possible balkanization of India if Modi intensifies his Hindu nationalism. Could you explain how that may occur?
Yes. So secularism in India is not just the negation of religion. Secularism really is an acceptance of everything, right? So India is a various society. India is the most diverse collection of communities in the world. When you impose upon them one language, one religion, one ideology, a lot of people will recoil. Take, for instance, the Indian state was able to win support for it from Christians in Nagaland, from Muslims in Kashmir, from Sikhs in Punjab, from Buddhists in Sikkim, primarily because religion was incidental to being Indian. You could belong to any religion and still be Indian. And in Kashmir, if you were a Muslim and said, I do not see myself as part of Indian, you could turn around and say, that is your problem. You see yourself as Muslim, and therefore you want to build walls around yourself, and you cannot mix with a society that contains non-Muslims. But you cannot make that argument now, can you? Because what do Kashmiris see when they look at India? They look at India and they see a country that is where people who eat beef or allegedly support Pakistan in a cricket match are hunted down, citizen charges are filed against them, they are killed by vigilantes. That is a de facto Hindu state. And when that state comes to you, it has no legitimacy. It can only hold you by force. There's the idea of an inclusive nation, especially in Kashmir, is not even available theoretically to the prime minister. I always remember Sheikh Abdullah, the founding prime minister of Kashmir, when Kashmir acceded under him to India. He said that Kashmiris will never accept a principle which seeks to favor the interests of one religion or one social group against the other. He was referring at the time to Pakistan. I think that argument applies today to India, because Kashmiris will still not accept a principle which seeks to favor the interests of one religion or one social group against the other. And I rather fear that in South India, people will recoil, because South is vastly more prosperous than the North, and eventually people will wonder, why on earth are we subsidizing these fanatics? And I often think, I say Balkanization, and the word comes, of course, from Yugoslavia, from the Balkans. I think about Yugoslavia. Mrs. Gandhi, Indira Gandhi, used to say that Yugoslavia was the one country in the world that reminded her of India, and when you look at a figure like Milosevic, so strikingly similar to Modi in his politics, inherits a country that is similarly pluralistic, multiple religions, multiple languages, and breaks it up. right? And the grievances of Serb nationalists are so similar to the grievances of Hindu nationalists. They too feel victims of Ottoman imperialism. They can't get over the defeat at the hands of Sultan Murad in 1389. So, they still hold on to that anger. And I fear that, a lot of Indians forget they take Indian unity for granted. India experienced partition just 70 years ago. Indian culture is antique, I grant you that. But Indian unity is rare and recent, and we mustn't take that for granted.
I mean, in many ways, I think this is an argument that you put forward before, and you sort of becoming more and more akin to a Hindu state, as you say, or a Hindu Pakistan. And Pakistan was founded as a state for Muslims. I would sort of, very minor quibble, but you say Indian state was able to win support from it from Christians in Nagaland, Muslims in Kashmir, Sikhs in Punjab, Buddhists in Sikkim. I agree, but I think in Kashmir perhaps it was a bit more of a tenuous support than in those other regions.
But it was still support. It was, it was still support, and you cannot generate that kind of support when you go as a Hindu imperium and saying why should they be part of India if you're going to say to them that
an inclusive vision. Well, how about some optimism then, Caps? Because this has been a pretty, it's a sad story, and it got sadder and sadder. So one of the prepared questions is you talk about how Modi has smashed the complacency that once governed the attitudes of many Indians and activated citizenly antibodies across the country. So do you see India standing at a potential crossroads, or where do we go from here? And another one which I would just throw into there right now is there's something else in the news, which is, of course, there are once again some back channels, apparently, and not just back channels, but overt diplomacy occurring with Pakistan. How do you see that going? And then can that shift the balance internally as well?
Right, those are two separate questions, right? So first I'll handle the Pakistan question. With Pakistan, I'm extremely pessimistic. And my position is we should foster deep and abiding relations with the people of Pakistan. You're Pakistani, I'm Indian. We have extremely close friendship. You're one of my oldest friends. But the state of Pakistan and the state of India, I feel that these peace overtures, always in my experience, are a prelude to inevitable eruption of violence that ends up retarding any relationship between ordinary Indians and ordinary Pakistanis. Why do we invest in this farce? Because we saw this happen in 1998. We saw this happen with Manmohan Singh. We saw this happen even with Modi. He made a surprise visit to Lahore and very newly into his office. And I remember writing at the time in the Observer in London that when you go and do this sort of thing, you actually endanger Democrats in Pakistan, because the army will inevitably, or forces entrenched there who do not want, you know this better than I do, but people who seek legitimacy on the basis of their animosity with India will always try to poison the peace process. So why not abandon that, and why not over the past decade, I have seen some unspeakable ugliness. India's film industry, Bollywood, has effectively stated on record that it will no longer employ Pakistani actors. And I don't think we would have come to that if we had, not created these high expectations, which invariably fail. So my position on that, I understand and appreciate others may have other positions, is I don't think we should invest our time and energies in building up hopes which will culminate inevitably in more anger, more hatred. That is the answer to that question. And to the second question that you asked, you packed two into it, was the optimism. So Modi's first term in office, 2014 to 2019, was replete with institutional subversion, which we've alluded to in this discussion. His second term in office, interestingly, is full of citizenly backlash. You saw that right now. India is home to one of the largest protests in human history. There was also a protest against Citizenship Amendment Act. Phenomenal protest. I mean, that was, I went to the protest site in Delhi. Their song was the national anthem. Their holy book was the Constitution of India, and this was an extraordinary uprising whose symbols were the symbols of India's nationalism, the flag, the constitution, the national anthem. This was an inclusive protest. But what is India's tragedy? There is nowhere in this earth, I would say, where people are more involved in taking back their democracy. But there is no opposition. There's no organized opposition. And that is India's greatest tragedy. The Congress Party, which is the oldest political organization in India, is run almost exclusively for the upkeep of the Gandhi dynasty. And as long as this great army, this great organization, is purposeless, you shouldn't be surprised that, marauders come and plunder your country. It's a bad example, bad metaphor, perhaps, but or bad analogy, perhaps. But here we are. India in 2024 will go to a point of no return if Prime Minister Modi wins a third term. And he will win a third term if the Congress Party goes to the electorate with Rahul Gandhi once again. Rahul Gandhi was the prime ministerial candidate 2 times, 2014, 2019. He was rejected overwhelmingly by the electorate twice. And to go a third time with the same option is not to prefer an alternative, it is to offer an insult. And members of the Congress Party who love India, and I know there are many, many Congress leaders who love India, should really come out of their stupor and push this dynasty out, reclaim the party, because the path to India's reclamation goes through Congress. As long as Congress, because Narendra Modi is the establishment now, and an organic uprising against the establishment can take decades to congeal. A nationwide party in India that can compete against Modi in every hamlet, every village, will take decades to come into existence, to find funding. There is such an organization already. Congress has the organizational wherewithal. So if Congress becomes a democratic entity, reformed, competent, lean, it could potentially give Modi a run for his money, even if it reduces him to a minority government. That is good enough. Then you can at least moderate his despotism. But if you don't have that, then I fear India will return to a point of no return in 2024.
But I don't know. As an outsider, it's hard for me to see Rahul Gandhi being displaced. So you had some fantastic reviews in the Guardian and in the Financial Times. Could you tell me, have you faced any backlash from the people you've written about, both on the Congress side and on the BJP side and Modi? Well, obviously Modi, we know he really follows you, but on the BJP side more broadly.
Yes, I would prefer not to talk about that. I get a lot of abuse on social media, but I'm not a martyr for it. But there's other forms of things that have happened that I'd like to keep private, because there's a bigger tragedy unfolding in front of us.
Of course. Should we go into the questions if we have any?
Yes.
Yeah, actually, we only have one. We have a couple of thank yous, very, very informative chat by Lek Raj. But here's our question from Deepika. My question: I just finished the chapter on the emergency and wondered whether you found it strange to write about it in the past tense, when much of the same applies to present day BJP and India.
Yeah, the way it happened, thank you for the question, Deepika, and thank you for joining this discussion. I wrote about the emergency because, as Issam alluded to, I started writing this book. I was approached to write this book, an overview of India's transformation under Modi. But I realized that to understand how we got Modi, we had to look to the past. So I started peeling the layers. I didn't want to quarantine history from. I didn't want to quarantine Modi from the history that gave rise to him. And I went right back to the foundation of India. And writing about the emergency, when you're looking at the emergency, you are looking at a country that is still hopeful. You're looking at a country that is defying expectations, going against the trend, and governing itself as a constitutional democracy. And I felt a real anger bubble up inside me when I was, writing about it. And some of that anger, yes, carried over from what is happening now. But what is happening now in so many ways is terrible and appalling. But I know this is not a fashionable thing to say, but it is not the emergency. 6.2 million people are not being surgically mutilated. I understand, I appreciate that there are internment camps being built, and the National Registry of Citizens, when it comes into force, could result, has the potential to result in persecution of a kind we haven't witnessed before. But before we arrive there, we have the opportunity to arrest that progress, stop ourselves from going to that point. And once again, I think to stop this government, we need a competent opposition. We are still nominally a democracy. We can still stop this prime minister. And I would urge every Indian to relinquish this idea that, this is how things are. This is how things will be. That is what V.S. Naipaul called Hindu fatalism. We have to give that up, because in 1915, Mahatma Gandhi came back to India. The British were raising a new capital called New Delhi, and they thought that India would, they thought that Britain would rule India for 1,000 years. The sun would never set on the British Empire. Within 30 years, just over 30 years later, Britain was gone and India was a free country. Who would have thought that Mahatma Gandhi, this man in a loincloth, would lead India to independence, and that India would be reborn as a democratic republic despite the ravages of partition and colonialism. So don't give up hope, and don't write India off. Just just work, do everything you can, perform your citizenly duty in making sure that the Congress party is purged of that parasitic, dynastic politics. We need to reclaim the Congress party and make it once again the vehicle of India's reclamation.
Caps, I'm just going to add one more question, and it's a very hopeful note, but where do you stand? Are you on the optimism, pessimism meter? I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic because I mean, obviously I feel pummeled every day by what is happening, but I'm optimistic. I don't write India off. I have faith in India for the simple reason that you look around India. I was recently in India, and I'll go back to India. I'll start traveling in India again, but I have friends who've gone out there and are setting up secular camps. There are millions and millions of Indians protesting in their small ways. An overwhelming majority of Indians, as I mentioned, haven't voted for this dispensation. India, like all society, has problems. It has many, many, many problems. But as far as Modi is concerned, I do believe that we can take the country back. Sometimes I have moments of great despondency. I feel that there's no way out of this. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. But it would be an abdication of one's citizenly responsibilities to think that this is it, because, as I mentioned, we've been through this before and we can recover from it. Right now, what I really want to do is to see a reformed Congress party, and I know for a fact that there are many leaders in the Congress party who also want that. And if Congress refuses to reform itself, there might be a split in the party. The party might rupture, and that's also a good thing, because that's the start of a renewal. And this stasis must end. There must be, an event in India, and this family must really step aside. And I hope that that happens soon, because the longer we leave it, there are 3 years between now and 2024. And in those 3 years, we need a party to be able to reform itself and retool itself for the fight of our life. And I hope that happens. Sorry, last question, which has come to mind, but obviously since I'm sitting in America and this talk is for an American audience, what about the US angle on this? What would you hope for the Biden administration, the new president here, in his engagement with India? Obviously, the US and India have become much closer partners and allies in the last 2 decades. And Modi has been embraced as well from Obama onwards. What would you hope from this administration?
I think I would like every foreign country to engage. The word I don't particularly like, but engage extensively with India, but not flatter Modi. And a lot of these foreign leaders, as I cite in my book, from Hollande to Cameron to Obama, invested a lot of their energies in flattering Modi. Obama went to Delhi and said, described Modi as he said Modi sleeps only 3 hours every night. Modi killed a crocodile as a child. All those things. He tamed a crocodile. Cameron put on an honor guard for him. Obviously, Modi is the occupant of India's highest political office. He's the head of the Indian government, so he's due the respect that he's due by protocol. But there is an India beyond Modi. And as I say, I'm the American government, as far as I feel, doesn't have the kind of credibility to carry Indian public opinion with it. So I think they will have to engage Modi. But I think the real opposition to Modi, the only people who can dislodge Modi, the only people who can reclaim India are Indians. Ultimately, when you're in a society, you find that nobody will come to your rescue. It's really down to you to do that work. And I think Indians have done it in the past, and I think they will do it again.
Thanks very much. I think that's all of my questions, unless Lane would have anything to add.
No, we have no more questions on this end, but I want to thank you both for being here. It's been our absolute pleasure. Here is the book. You can order this through us. You can call us or do it through our website. Once again, thank you to Issam and to Kapil. And to the rest of you, as always, be kind to each other. Wear your mask for just a little while longer. We're almost there. And get vaccinated as soon as you can. And we love you all. Have a great night.